Welcome back to the Gearhead Lounge and our series on the history of the Chrysler Hemi. Before I go any farther, I just want to thank you all for the overwhelming response we've received on the first video on the first generation Chrysler Hemi. That plus the history of the Yenko Stinger pushed us over the 7,000 subscriber mark. Thank you so very much. But I'm not going to hold you any longer. In our last video, we talked about the first generation Chrysler Hemi. Now, if you thought that was a formidable engine, just wait till I add another 34 cubes to it. So step into the lounge and let's talk about the history of the second generation Chrysler Hemi.
Ready, here we go.
25,000. This is a matching number car now. Matching number Chevelle. With a 4-speed and air condition. What are we doing, guys? 25,500. Negative 25,500. Negative 25,500. 25,500. 25,500. Let's go. Tony, push it out, please. Here, 25 grand, 25,500. Number 25, we all done. There goes the better car, ladies and gentlemen. 25 pound last call. 25,500.
In episode 1, we talked about how, during World War II, Chrysler designed and developed their own engine with hemispherical combustion chambers for use in aviation, how the project was canceled due to the war being over, and how that technology led to the Chrysler Firepower, the DeSoto Fire Dome, and the Dodge Red Ram Hemi street engines. It's quite a fascinating story of how things came together thanks to people like James Zeter, Bob Roger, and Virgil Exner. We also talked about how all of those engines were discontinued by 1960 due to the development of the cheaper to build and produce B and RB series engines. In this episode, we're going to talk about how the hemispherical combustion chamber was revived to produce a new kind of engine that once again dominated not only on the track, but on the streets as well. It's 1958, and Chrysler, along with Ford and GM, had decided to withdraw from financially supporting race teams, as well as not campaigning their own. As I said in the previous video, racing improves the breed. And, well, while there was still racing going on, auto manufacturers like Chrysler weren't sponsoring any teams, which meant that there was very little racing development going on, leading to an even smaller percentage of that technology making it to street cars. Win on Sunday, sell on Monday was more than just a saying. It was a truth and could influence the success or failure of an automotive brand. Even though the manufacturers weren't officially racing, people were still racing on the streets and at their local racetracks all across America. One of the easier forms of racing to get into was drag racing. The thing about drag racing is that you could do it anywhere, anytime. If a particular manufacturer's car had a reputation for being slow, it filtered down to the streets and had a direct effect on how the car sold. Fast cars equaled sales. At the same time in 1958, a few Chrysler Engineering Institute students, along with engineers, began to get together over lunch. All being fellow gearheads, and a few were weekend racers. They would talk and sometimes pool their knowledge to help each other individually with their personal race cars. Many of them realized that while separately they were meagerly successful, it was nothing compared to working as a team. So, in the fall of 1958, a group of about 25 Chrysler engineering students, along with Chrysler engineers, got together to form an after-hours racing team. They decided to pool their money together, use their working knowledge to build a race car that would put anything GM could build back on the trailer. What they came up with was Ramrod. Ramrod was a 1949 Plymouth business coupe. It's not clear as to why they picked it, possibly because it was light, or maybe because it was available for the right price. The Ramchargers divided themselves into three groups. The first group would handle the chassis, the second group would handle body mods, and the third group would be in charge of the engine. Power for Ramrod was a salvaged 354 Hemi with 392 heads, and topped off with what could only be a prototype Tonoram intake. No doubt the inspiration to the car's initial name. The crew at Chrysler was just discovering the ramming effects of long intake runners, and no doubt served as the inspiration for their intake manifold technology that followed in the 60s, namely the line of wild-looking cross rams and box intakes. The engine was fed by a pair of Carter 4-barrel carbs with a custom-fabbed air scoop on top. The exhaust gases were handled by 8 individual exhaust trumpets that exited straight out of the front fenders for a real menacing look and one hell of a sound. The chassis group treated the coupe to a lifted suspension and a shortened wheelbase, moving the rear wheels closer to the center of the car. This was done to make sure that the weight transferred to the rear quicker, planting the rear tires to the road. With the shortened wheelbase, the body crew had the choice of either modifying the fenders or yanking them off, to which they performed the latter. With the raised ride height, the roof was chopped 4 inches to improve the aerodynamics. They pretty much turned a brick into a slightly smaller brick. But that brick certainly did run. It made its debut at the '59 NHRA Nationals in Detroit. Ramrod retired early due to a blown engine, but not before setting the top speed in its class at 109.75 miles per hour. The Ramchargers continued to repair and refine the Plymouth as they campaigned it. When they returned to the NHRA Nationals in 1960, Ramrod was running 11s at 117 miles an hour, enough to win its class. With that class win, the Ramchargers renamed the Plymouth the High and Mighty, also no doubt to the height of the intake manifold. Unfortunately, the curse of the Hemi struck again, as the NHRA introduced additional rules that limited how high a race car's crankshaft could be from the ground, and also limited the engine's overall weight per cubic inch, pretty much ruling the High and Mighty out of competition. However, that didn't stop Chrysler from racing. By 1961, the AMA ban was lifted, well, more like ignored, but lifted is still a good word. The Ramchargers approached Plymouth and Dodge officials to see if they were interested in sponsoring them with a stock car to run, something that looked like what was on the showroom floors, making them highly appealing to young people. Plymouth declined. However, Dodge jumped at the chance and gave them a '61 two-door sedan, to which they took it to the U.S. Nationals, but lost in the semifinals due to a broken transmission. The race was won by Dino Don Nicholson. They fixed the car, and on that Monday, the announcer asked if the crowd would like to see Don race the Dodge. The Ramchargers took their '61 and staged it next to Nicholson's ride, and promptly beat him. Enter Lynn Townsend. He joined Chrysler in 1957 as a controller and moved up to Group Vice President in 1958. By 1960, he was Chrysler's Administrative Vice President and then President in July of 1961. During that time of his rise, he was approached by his 2 sons who showed him that Chrysler products didn't relate to young people because in their terms, Chryslers were not cool and that the Pontiacs and Chevys ruled the streets. But they also made him aware of the Ramchargers and how they beat the fastest Chevy around. That was all Lynn needed to hear. He called the motor room at Chrysler Engineering and spoke to Tom Hoover, one of the founding Ramchargers organizers. By the end of the conversation, Tom was made the race program coordinator for the engineering division. Through racing with the Ramchargers, Tom was instrumental in taking what they learned from the High and Mighty's tall ram intake and developing a cross-ram intake manifold that could take advantage of the ram effect as well as pressure waves while remaining under the hood. This technology led to the development of the 413 Max Wedge engine. Max Wedge stood for Maximum Performance Wedge and was the performance engine for Dodge and Plymouth in their B-bodies. Dodge marketed the package as the Ramcharger, while Plymouth marketed theirs by calling it the Superstock. The Max Wedge grew to 426 cubes in June of '63. With the Max Wedge becoming the dominant force in drag racing, Dodge and Plymouth also campaigned it in NASCAR. But it wasn't so dominant on the ovals. Again, what wins on Sunday sells on Monday, so Chrysler execs called on Tom Hoover and his team to see what could be done. In a meeting, Tom relayed that the problem was related to the design of the cylinder heads. The combustion chamber location contributed to shrouding of the valves, limiting flow. The bottom line was that the heads simply didn't flow as well as the competition, which prompted the execs to ask, what would it take to win Daytona Beach in 1964? Tom responded with that for the high output and the high airflow configuration, they had the most confidence in the hemispherical combustion chamber. With that, Tom and his team got the green light. Using much of the data they gathered from the A311 program, quickly got to work in adapting the original cast iron Hemi heads to the 426 RB engine, codenamed A864. The team modified the heads and the engine block to work together successfully, coming up with a 426 that was going to be strictly a 4-race only engine. On December 5, 1963, they developed a running prototype suitable for testing. Through endurance testing on the dyno, they simulated the 500 miles at Daytona. It's through the simulated racing environment that they ran into problems with the engine block cracking on the dyno due to extremely thin cylinder walls. By now, the '64 Daytona 500 was less than a month away, so they had to work feverishly to thicken up the cylinder walls, and on February 11th, during Daytona Speed Weeks, they were able to successfully cast 12 engine blocks strong enough for the rigors of the Daytona 500. Once the engines got to Daytona, it was pretty much a wrap. King Richard Petty took his Plymouth Belvedere out for a qualifying lap. The previous day, a Mercury set a new lap record of 169.014 miles an hour. Petty's qualifying lap destroyed the Mercury at 174.639 miles an hour. Plymouth driver Paul Goldsmith took the pole with a lap of 174.910 miles an hour. But it was Petty that took top honors by winning the race in his '64 Plymouth Belvedere. Goldsmith took third, while Jimmy Pardue finished second, all in '64 Plymouths. The Dodge entries finished 4th and 9th. Needless to say, the Plymouth dealerships were swamped following the race, with people wanting to drive home in the same car that won Daytona. But since the 426 Hemi was a race engine only, no one could purchase a Hemi-powered Chrysler product. Throughout the 1964 season, the 426 Hemi proved to be a very formidable competitor. The drivers had some issues driving on road courses due to the amount of horsepower the Hemi made, but it was a time of learning for each of them. Petty won the Drivers' Championship, although it was Ford bringing home the Manufacturers' Championship. NASCAR officials, as well as some drivers, were fearful that the Hemi could completely dominate the series, so much so that even Ford tried to legalize their new monster 427 single overhead cam engine. But more on this engine later. NASCAR didn't allow the engine into competition, but instead developed new homologation rules for the series for the 1965 season. In 1964, each manufacturer had to produce at least 500 versions of the same car that raced on the tracks. Also, the engine displacement limit was 7 liters or 427 cubic inches. Ford already campaigned a 427, while Chrysler's Hemi was at 426. Chevy had pulled out of competition in 1964, so they weren't even there. However, NASCAR officials could see a trend brewing that could ramp up speeds and competition to unsafe levels. As a result, for 1965, NASCAR raised the production requirement to 1,000 units, limited the engines to a single carburetor, and banned mid-sized cars. Since Chrysler's Hemi really wasn't in any production cars anyway, it was ineligible for 1965, along with the Plymouth Belvedere and the Dodge Coronet, since they were mid-sized cars. Chrysler and their drivers boycotted the 1965 season in protest, leaving Ford and Mercury to duke it out the entire season. However, that didn't mean that Chrysler had stopped racing the Hemi. No way. For 1965, the Hemi was used in many forms of racing other than NASCAR. In particular, 4 of them found their way to Bonneville, powering the land speed racer Goldenrod, where it brought the land speed record back to America with a two-way average of 409.227 miles an hour. That same year, Leroy Yarborough drove a Ray Fox Automotive-built Dodge Coronet, complete with a blown 426 Hemi, to a closed course record of 181.818 miles an hour. You could even find a Hemi thundering up Pikes Peak, several of them to be exact. One in particular was Paul Goldsmith's Hemi Belvedere. Although he qualified on the pole in the stock car category, a little off-course excursion prevented his finishing. However, Chrysler focused its major sponsorships on drag racing, where many of Chrysler's NASCAR drivers ended up. Even King Richard Petty campaigned a Hemi drag car. Chrysler had plans on dominating the superstock classes in NHRA and AHRA. Like NASCAR, the NHRA and AHRA had homologation rules, but not as strict. To be legal, Chrysler had to offer the Hemi in at least 50 vehicles. Once again, it was Tom Hoover and his team to the rescue. What they put together was a ready-to-go race car straight from the factory. The A864 package was Chrysler's race Hemi offered for off-road use, not meant for the streets. For Dodge, the A864 was an option for their 1964 330 and 440 cars, and Savoy and Belvedere vehicles for Plymouth, again offered as off-road only, not for street use. The package focused around the 426 race Hemi with cast iron cylinder heads and a 12.5 to 1 compression ratio. The intake manifold was Chrysler's dual quad cross ram intake cast in aluminum, topped off with a pair of Carter AFB 750 CFM carburetors initially, but switched over to the better performing 770 CFM Holley carbs right before the production run. About 70 prototypes were Carter AFB equipped. Exhaust gases exited using factory exhaust headers that funneled into a single exhaust, but featured cutouts when at the track. Customers had the option of either a 4-speed manual or a TorqueFlite push-button automatic that transferred power to a sure grip differential with 456 gears. The cars themselves were lightened up for drag race use. The steel front fenders, hood scoop, doors with hinges, as well as the front bumper and brackets were all swapped out for identical pieces made out of aluminum. The radio and heater were deleted while the battery was moved to the trunk. The torsion bar front suspension was loosened up with lighter springs to help the front end transfer the weight to the rear quickly. The interior was stripped down to its bare essentials utilizing lightweight carpet, lightweight interior panels, deleted sound deadening as well as deleted undercoating. The standard seats were replaced with A100 van seats. The rear seats removed entirely. The inboard headlights removed, and all the glass was replaced with thinner, lighter units. How well did the A864 package work? So well that the Hemi completely dominated in the superstock classes in 1964.
Buster Couch punches the button, and they're off. And the TorqueFlite takes the run with an 11.39 ET. Top end speed, 128.93 miles per hour.
For the 1965 season, the NHRA ruled that manufacturers weren't allowed to use exotic metals in the vehicle's construction, which meant that aluminum body panels were no longer legal. So Chrysler engineers got even more creative for the 1965 model year with the A990 Hemi drag package. Available for either the Plymouth Belvedere or Dodge Coronet, these cars received the same interior treatment as their 64 counterparts, but the front ends were lightened by the use of thinner gauge sheet metal instead of aluminum for the front fenders, hood, doors, and front bumper. Under the hood, the iron head 864 Hemi was replaced with the A990 Hemi that included lighter aluminum heads, aluminum water pump, and a cross-ram intake cast in even lighter magnesium. However, the Superstock class Hemi race cars started going for more horsepower and faster numbers. Race teams began to alter the wheelbase as well as switch to nitromethane as fuel. These Superstock cars began bleeding off into the AFX class, which would eventually lead to early funny cars and the full tilt monsters we see today. Unfortunately, Chrysler was still looking at selling Hemi street cars, and a shortened wheelbase Belvedere wasn't it. By mid-1965, NASCAR was feeling the pressure of a Ford-only competition and allowed the Hemi back into racing. So in 1966, Chrysler jumped back into NASCAR with the A117 Hemi. NASCAR still had its ban on large displacement, so this new race Hemi was based on the A864, sharing the same bore size, but with a shorter 3.5-inch stroke, measuring 404 cubic inches. Being down on horsepower, the A117 came equipped with a single 4-barrel box intake known as the bathtub. But it was enough for Richard Petty to win the Daytona 500 as well as bring home 8 victories, 15 poles, and 20 top 5s that year, in addition to finishing 3rd in the championship points. To make the A117 legal for competition, Chrysler engineers were working on a more streetable version of the Hemi at the beginning of '65, with plans of not only homologating the Hemi for NASCAR competition again, but also to compete in NHRA's stock eliminator class. What developed for the 1966 model year was the A102. The A102 was very close to the race engine, except it displaced 426 cubic inches again. Using cast iron heads, the compression ratio was dialed back to 10.25 to 1, and a smaller solid lift camshaft was utilized for street use. Also, the dual quad cross ram intake was swapped out for a standard inline dual quad intake to simplify for the streets. Rated at 425 horsepower, the Street Hemi obviously made much more, but just about every manufacturer was lowballing their horsepower numbers at that time. The first cars to receive the 426 Street Hemi as an optional engine were the 1966 Plymouth Belvedere and Satellite and the Coronet and Charger for Dodge. In 1967, the model lines included the Plymouth GTX. In addition to the Street Hemi, Dodge and Plymouth were still offering their Hemi drag package. In 1967, option code RO23 got you a Plymouth Belvedere, while WO23 got you a Dodge Coronet. Under the hoods featured a warmed-up A102 Street Hemi that sported an additional 50 horses. It was good enough for 13.5 quarter-mile times right off the showroom floor. In '68, the amount of Hemi cars grew with the addition of the Plymouth Roadrunner and Dodge Super Bee. The drag package option was also stepped up a notch with the LO23 and BO29 option for the Dodge Dart and Plymouth Barracuda, otherwise known as the Superstock cars. Built by Hearst, the Superstock cars were just that, built to compete in NHRA Superstock. They were stripped of any unnecessary weight or accessories, lightened extensively with fiberglass front end pieces, and modified rear wheel openings to accommodate larger drag slicks. Under the hood was a dual quad cross-rammed 426 Hemi with a 12.5 to 1 compression ratio. Horsepower numbers were rumored to be in the 540 range and were said to run constant 10-second quarter-mile times. In 1970, the mechanical camshaft was exchanged for a hydraulic lift camshaft. The Plymouth Belvedere ceased production, and while the Dodge Coronet shared the same platform, continued on, with the option for the Hemi being discontinued. However, Dodge and Plymouth redirected those Hemis into two brand new vehicles, the Dodge Challenger and a redesigned Plymouth Barracuda's new performance option, the Cuda. On the streets, the Hemi was a formidable power plant, but in stock form, it struggled against its sibling, the 440. The 426 Hemi was pretty much a tamed-down race engine with huge ports. Its power was generated in the higher RPM range, whereas the 440, while 45 horsepower shy of the Hemi, generated almost the same torque numbers at 3,200 RPM versus the Hemi's 4,000 RPM. This meant that with all other things being equal, a 440 could beat a Hemi from stoplight to stoplight. A modified Hemi, on the other hand, was a completely different story. Unfortunately, between the rising costs of car insurance, the continued tightening of emissions regulations, as well as the need for more fuel-efficient vehicles, there was just no room for the Hemi on the streets anymore. 1971 was the last year of the second-generation Hemi being produced for street cars. The racetrack, however, is where the Hemi lived and thrived. In 1967, NASCAR raised the cubic inch limit rules, and the 426 Hemi was once again a dominating force on the superspeedways. The 426 Hemi was designed and built to be in its element at high speeds, and while the Plymouth Belvedere and Dodge Charger weren't the most aerodynamic cars, the Hemi didn't really care. It won regardless. I believe that the Hemi reached its pinnacle in NASCAR in 1969 and 1970, the absolute best years for muscle cars. It was in 1969 that we were introduced to the Charger 500 and later the Charger Daytona. 1970 gave us the Plymouth Superbird. To get some in-depth information on the Charger 500 and Daytona, check out my video on the history of the Dodge Charger. In a nutshell, the Charger 500, Daytona, and Plymouth Superbird were developed in a wind tunnel to really use the air going around it at high speeds. The more radical Daytona and Superbird featured a 440 under the hood as a standard street engine with the Hemi as an option. However, the full-race NASCAR racer used the race Hemi exclusively. The unique nose cone and attention-grabbing rear wing was fully functional, making them really easy to spot from a distance. While they look somewhat bulky on the street-going homologation cars, they look rather menacing on the superspeedways, and the superspeedways is where they were designed to work. They worked so well that the first Grand National car to break 200 miles an hour was Buddy Baker driving a Charger Daytona at Talladega in 1970. While the street Hemi ended in 1971, the race Hemi ran in cars all the way up until 1975, until NASCAR imposed a cubic inch limit of 6 liters, or 366 cubes, causing Chrysler to introduce the LA-based 355 engine. By the 1976 season, the Hemi was gone from the superspeedways. But it wasn't gone from racing completely. In fact, just as the street Hemi was being discontinued in 1971, a savvy racer and engine builder named Ed Donovan introduced the drag racing world to his brand new Hemi-headed engine, the Donovan 417. As I stated earlier, the Hemi was a pretty dominant force in the NHRA, starting with the original firepower. Well, just as anything in racing, the quest for faster ETs and more power led to innovations in technology, particularly in fuels. Nitromethane became real popular with the faster Hemis. Nitro, not to be confused with nitrous, had been around for a long time, even decades before the surfers began using it in their drag cars, so engine builders were familiar with its characteristics. One thing they knew for sure was that it was a temperamental fuel and can be very unforgiving. The Hemi of choice back in that day was the first Gen 392. There were plenty of them to be had and they reacted well with the fuel. However, to run nitromethane, you needed an engine with a pretty stout bottom end, and unfortunately that was one of the 392's shortcomings. According to this Hot Rod article from February 1972, Ed Donovan, like many racers of the day, preferred the first gen Hemi over the second gen 426 Hemi. So every time a 392 blew up, replacement blocks were getting harder to find. That's when Ed stepped in with his company, Donovan Engineering, to design an engine block that could address the shortcomings of the original 392 in a way that the average Joe racer could afford. What Donovan Engineering came up with was the Donovan 417. It was the original intent to keep all of the advantages of the original 392 while addressing the shortcomings. The end result was so much more. An aluminum engine block with chrome moly wet sleeves that could be swapped out, and a girdle for strength. How well did the 417 do? In its debut at the 71 NHRA Super Nationals, John Wiebe ran a low ET of 653 to grab the number one qualifying position. However, he finished second due to blowing away his tires in the final round. Now don't get me wrong, 653 wasn't the fastest time ever at that time. I mean, Don Garlits had run a blistering 621 at the US Nationals that same year with the Swamp Rat 14, the very first rear-engine dragster that was also Hemi-powered, but with the 426. So the Donovan 417 wasn't about being the fastest, it was about being innovative enough so that by the end of the day, you were still running. The overall design of the 417 not only made it much stronger, but it saved money in the long run for repairs. Instead of replacing a rear engine block if you burned a piston, all you needed to do was yank the cylinder head off and install a new cylinder sleeve. It was this Donovan 417 engine design, along with the rear engine Swamp Rat 14, that changed Top Fuel forever. By 1974, the entire landscape of Top Fuel had changed. The front engine dragsters disappeared and were replaced by the safer rear engine dragsters. With the success of the Donovan 417, the stock block firepower Hemi remained mostly in street cars. However, in spite of the 417, there were still racers that still raced the RB 426 Hemi. So it was only a matter of time before someone saw the need to build a stronger RB Hemi. That someone would be Keith Black Racing Engines. Keith Black Racing Engines was already a successful engine builder, already having produced his own aluminum engine blocks. But I don't think even they could have imagined the impact they would have on the Top Fuel classes. Keith Black Racing Engines introduced their first all-aluminum Hemi in 1974. Like the Donovan 417, the Keith Black Hemi was an aluminum engine block with replaceable sleeves. This made engine repairs in the pits a cinch. Each subsequent generation brought new innovations that made the Keith Black Hemi stronger and more powerful. By 1984, Keith Black powered dragsters held every national record in Top Fuel. These days, a Top Fuel engine displaces a maximum of 500 cubic inches, usually around 496, and can produce 11,000 horsepower. A Top Fuel dragster can accelerate from 0 to 100 in less than a second while pulling 5 Gs off the starting line. A little more than 3.5 seconds later, you're 1,000 feet down the road barreling at over 330 miles an hour. Keith Black Racing Engines Hemi became the standard against which everything else was measured in Top Fuel. The Hemi is Top Fuel. I mentioned earlier that all the while Chrysler was dominating in NASCAR in 1964, Ford was coming up with a Hemi engine of their own. The 427 single overhead cam engine, otherwise known as the sock motor. Based on the 427 side oiler, the single overhead cam engine featured a single camshaft mounted atop a massive Hemi head, one per engine bank. These camshafts were synced together using a 6-foot-long timing chain hanging on the front of the engine, making it look colossal inside the engine bay. Power output was an impressive 616 horsepower at 7,000 RPM and 515 pound-feet of torque at 3,800 RPM. Chrysler countered with the A925, a dual overhead cam 426 engine that was referred to as the dual overhead cam Hemi, although the combustion chambers were actually a pent roof design as opposed to being hemispherical. They produced 2 prototypes that never ran but were driven by an electric motor to test the valve train. Years later, it was told that former Ramchargers member David Rockwell and historian Stuart Pomeroy admitted that the A925 program was actually a fake endeavor in order to get NASCAR's Bill France to ban Ford's stock engine. Once the Ford engine was banned, all development on the dual overhead cam Hemi stopped. As awesome as the street Hemi was, it had a few drawbacks. It was an expensive to build, heavy race engine come street engine. Plus, the B and RB series engines utilized 3 engine blocks and 2 sets of heads to build the 383, 400, and 440. Chrysler's goal was to develop an engine that would cover these 3 engines with only 2 displacements, 400 and 444 cubic inches, using only 1 engine block. This would cut production costs as well as being able to fit in a larger variety of vehicles. In 1968, Chrysler came up with the A279, otherwise known as the ball stud Hemi. Of course, the main attraction were the cylinder heads. Utilizing the hemispherical combustion chamber, the A279 used the same valves as the 426, with the only difference being that the valves were placed in a canted position as if the entire combustion chamber was rotated. The rocker arm setup wasn't the same rail-mounted short long arm design as in the past. Instead, they were based on a straight 6-engine design that was used in Chrysler's Australian engines. They were mounted to a pedestal using studs and rotated on a half-ball design, hence the ball stud name. The engine showed great promise. However, with the dark cloud of emissions regulations, a pending fuel shortage, and rising insurance costs, Chrysler stopped further development in 1969, with the 426 Hemi following 2 years later. For a great video on giving a breakdown on the ball stud Hemi and what happened to it, check out Vic's Garage. Click on the link in the upper right hand corner to watch the video. The 426 Hemi was a race engine through and through. If not for the need to continue racing, we would have never seen this phenomenal power plant on the streets at all. It dominated in NASCAR. It was the first to reach 200 miles an hour on the super speedways. It was so good, it was banned twice. It completely changed drag racing, Top Fuel in particular. These changes are responsible for modern Top Fuel cars running 300 plus miles an hour today. As a street engine, it had its ups and downs, but such are the perils when you go for mass production. Stifling a race engine for the street hampered its performance in some areas, so it would often take second place to its brother, the 440. However, it responded well to simple mods, so much so that a modified street Hemi was virtually untouchable. Fast or not, nothing compared to popping the hood on a Hemi-powered Mopar. Engines come and go, but very few have the legacy or the pedigree that the 426 Hemi enjoys. Chrysler originally produced around 9,000 engines, making them kind of rare. They're desirable enough to where a 426 Hemi-powered car can add a couple of zeros to the overall value of a car. A 426 Hemi car is the holy grail, the pot of gold, the pinnacle, the grand slam in the car world. But in its rarity, the 426 lives on in crate engines, allowing anyone with enough funds to build their own Hemi car just the way they like it without ruining an original. While there were certainly other Hemi engines produced around the same time, there are none like the 426 Hemi. It's a unique piece of machinery that was intimidating to own, dominating over all opposition, all-consuming if unleashed, yet beautiful to behold and sought after by countless. Chrysler engineers had no idea of the movement they began when they decided to go racing in a first-generation firepower. a movement that would begin almost 30 years later for what seems to be his final curtain call. Stay tuned.